So as those of you who've been here both days would have noticed, our talks today were more an attempt to bring us down from the 30,000 foot level that we were talking about at climate change and its impacts yesterday to more of how it's actually impacting humans and, you know, on the ground, the impacts that are being felt. And this session, the last session today is designed to go further in that direction and to sort of actually bring in non-academics, some folks from the private sector and the extension and this representing the government and the private sector, to look at, you know, how they are facing these, what kind of impacts they are facing, and how they are dealing with that, and what that implies for, you know, things that we should be thinking about in the future. From both a research perspective as well as more from an action-related, action-oriented perspective. So I'm going to quickly introduce our panel, and unlike our other talks today, where these were more presentation-heavy, our panel here has been asked to give short talks, very short talks on a set of questions that I had sent them, and then we'll like to make this much more interactive and have you ask questions and make this more of a discussion. So with that, our four speakers, the first one is Jim Angel. He's the Illinois State Climatologist since 1997, also an alum of the University of Illinois. And, you know, he works both on assessing future climate change impacts, developing some tools to do that, as well as working with stakeholders in the state. Our second speaker is Dion McBay, who is the Global Sustainable Development Lead at Monsanto, and he oversees the company's climate change initiatives and works with programs for developing carbon neutral commitments, as well as looking at local water quality and other programs. The next speaker is Bill Northcott, who is the co-founder and chief innovation officer of Agrible, and he is an expert in agricultural hydrology and crop water use, and also looks at the impacts of climate change on agriculture production systems, data science, and software development. Also an alum of the university, right? You're also from the University of Illinois? Yes. Yes, that's right. And then our last speaker is Steve Smith, who is the Global Technology Transfer Leader for Dow Agrosciences. He's also been working he's also on the steering team of the Hunger Solutions Network and the Indie Hunger Network, which is a nonprofit collaborative impact organization. So I had asked them to talk about, you know, what are some of the major climate-related risks that they are dealing with in their, organization, and both looking at the near term and the long term. What is the level of concern that they're encountering among their clients and stakeholders, and how they, their organization is helping their stakeholders to adapt and address those risks. The role of technology, what's the role that they see of technological development in helping to mitigate some of these impacts of climate change and how they're working towards that. And then what is the role that they see for partnerships with the academic community to try to develop some actionable solutions. So those are sort of broad questions that I hope they will cover, and we'll just start maybe here. We'll start with you first, and then we'll have sort of questions and discussion at the end. So Bill actually doesn't have a talk, so maybe we'll just all right.
Yeah, so I'll just get up and really I like to have a conversation type of format. So I'm one of the co-founders and chief innovation officer at Agrible Incorporated. It's a local company here in town, really developed by a group of agricultural engineers and agronomists. And one of the things that I do is work on the technological side of things, as far as modeling and weather and forecasting, and crop water use, and estimating production from a variety of technological means. I sort of come from a little bit of a different background. Even though I am in the private sector now, I spent 12 years as a faculty member at Michigan State University in the Agricultural and Biosystems Engineering Department. And so, I've got sort of an academic type of look upon things, even though I work in the private sector. And so there's, I want to address some of these questions and sort of talk about how we as a company look at these things and work on them. And really, the major climate-related risks that we look at, we work as a company both here in the United States, and we also work globally. We work in several countries. We have a partnership with AB InBev, and we work on barley production around the world, mostly focused in South America and South Africa, and which have a different type of problem with climate change than we do here in the United States. And much of it deals with water, whether it's too much water or not enough water. Here in the United States, we've seen a lot of improvement, especially in a lot of the data science that we do about improving crop yields and being able to mitigate, the effects of climate as far as protracted drought conditions go in the United States. We see those, raising levels of crop yield and less impact, at least in corn, soybean production. But one of the things that we do see is larger rainfall events that affect especially the poorly drained Midwestern states, and the impacts that those have. Hail impacts. One of the things that we provide for our growers and users of our technology are hail reports. So in nearly real time, they get reports that come to them, either text or an email, that tell them when a hail event has occurred on a specific field. We're able to through our analytics and algorithms be able to tell what type of hail event, the duration, the intensity, and the potential impact that it has. So that's some of the kinds of technology that we use. But one of the things that we see as far as climate goes is, and maybe Jim can speak to this a little bit, and we can talk about it a little later. When I was working at Michigan State, I did some climate work, and we saw that the Midwest seems to be getting wetter since the 1980s or so. And we're seeing a bit more of impact of having too much rain at one time on crop yields. I own a farm myself, so I know the good years, the bad years, and from an economic standpoint, for me as a grower outside of all of this, it's the wet years that hurt me the most, because if I get say 6 inches of rain in 4 days, I have a lot of problems on the field, and reduced yields. I tend to lose a lot of nitrogen with those things. Whereas to be honest, the drought of 2012, it was my most profitable year I've had in the last 10 years on my own operation, just because the economics of the markets, crop prices went up. I really wasn't hit that badly, and so I made a lot of money that year. Whereas these wet years, in areas where we see higher yields, locally though, we can have very poor yields intermixed with higher yields overall, lower prices, and these last several years, I've had wonderful crops. The markets have been so poor that I really don't make any money out of it. And so that's something that I think growers have to deal with, are the economic side of things that climate change has to do, because I think it really does sort of affect the markets and really their sort of bottom line. On the other hand from that, I've worked in Africa. The last couple of years, I worked, Agrible worked with Michigan State University and the University of Dar es Salaam in Tanzania, looking at the Rufiji River Basin and looking at climate change. One, looking at projected land use changes as they're moving more from natural grazing lands into agriculture, increased population, and then the effect of climate change over the top of that. And so one of the things that we did was use our expertise in modeling and working with the climate scientists is to looking at how the impacts of increasing agricultural production in a country like this has on the water resources of the entire nation, because much of their power comes from hydroelectric plants, and one of the things that they've had to do is basically shut down their hydroelectric systems in many parts of the country because they run out of water. Not because the water's there, but because of large-scale irrigation going on, and people that are regulated and registered to do this, along with other people that who are not, taking water and literally leaving a trickle to get down to their hydroelectric plants. And so we're working on ways projecting out land use and the growth of agriculture in the country, and looking at ways that the smallholder farmers in Tanzania could harvest water better, be more efficient in their agricultural production. And so we used our technology to be able to look at that. And I've got 25 years of crop modeling experience, so we've done a lot of work like that. And so those are some of the different ways that we've gone about doing this, whereas it's different in the U.S. than it is globally. So when it comes to things as sort of the level of concern for our clients, most of the time, most of our users, at least in the U.S., are larger scale farmers. 1,000 acres or more use our products. So currently we have probably, I'd say about 11,000 users use our morning farm report and our related technologies to help them manage their operations. And there's not a whole lot of talk about climate change. It continues to be sort of a voodoo subject, I think. I think they realize it. They really don't talk about it with us. They see things more as the weather rather than the climate. When it comes to our clients trying to adapt to climate change, I really don't, we help them with the weather. We help them decide, should I spray today? When can I spray this week? Do we have a temperature inversion, at 8 o'clock this morning when I want to spray dicamba? I think most of the way that they adapt to climate change is they are more using different seeds, GMO technologies, where they can plant crops that are say that they can mitigate drought effects, which seem to be doing a very good job. And I think that's the same here in the U.S., and we see the same thing in South Africa, is that there's many GMO products that have really sort of increased the level of production in some of these countries. I think some of the greatest potentials that we have for partnerships when it comes to the academic community is, at least for our company, we slip into that role rather easily, since we have several retired faculty members that work for us, And so, we've come from or have a very strong academic partnership type of mentality. So, when we have opportunities to, we work with the academia when it comes to doing research projects. We have a few folks here on campus that we do a little bit of work with now and then. We use our technology to help them do their projects, and I think I think it works out pretty well. But that's really sort of all I've got for this. If I don't know, do we have some questions now, or? Okay.
Okay, our next speaker is Jim Angel.
All right. Thank you. I'm Jim Angel, the Illinois State Climatologist. I'm located at the Illinois State Water Survey, which is on the south side of campus there. And we're part of the Prairie Research Institute. And my interest in the water survey is on the rainfall side, but we also have folks there that look at groundwater and surface water issues as well. So I spent a lot of time talking about climate change, probably more so now than I used to. 20 years ago when I first started this job, we talked a lot about floods and droughts and the parts of the climate, but now we're starting to do a lot more conversation on climate change. And it's always kind of interesting. I always get asked on the street about, whether I believe in climate change. And I say, well, I don't. It's kind of it's not a belief thing. It's actual just observations and the science of it. And nobody ever asked me if I believe in floods or droughts or anything like that. So it's kind of odd that here we got this physical process and they're asking if I believe in it. So if we look at Illinois, kind of in the broad context here, over the past century, we've seen warming in Illinois about a degree and a half over the last century. And a lot of that has occurred in the wintertime and in the springtime months. And if you look at the United States on this map here, you see the other parts of the United States have actually warmed much more than we have. You go out west, much warmer, Alaska. You go visit our friends up north in Wisconsin and Minnesota, and they're seeing much warmer conditions up there. In fact, it's pretty dramatic, especially on the wintertime conditions in those northern states right now. So we're kind of, I don't want to call it a sweet spot, but we're in a state where we don't see some of the big impacts that we're seeing in some of the other states right now. It's more of a modest increase in temperatures over the last century or so. But even so, it can have big impacts on us, and we're already starting to feel some of that. This is the same shameless plug of my granddaughter here that found a woolly worm in January. Now, you've probably heard the folklore about woolly worms in the fall, predicting the coming winter. I don't know what it means when you find one in January, other than it was a very mild January. And if you look at this last January or this last winter, if you may recall here, we had very mild temperatures, very little snowfall. And if you look at the projections for mid-century, that's about 4 degrees, and that's above normal, and that's what this last winter was. So you kind of think of that as kind of being like an analog for what we might experience at mid-century. So here it's the woolly worm, but if you talk to Kelly Estes and some of the other folks on the ag side, there's also a lot of overwintering of pests and overwintering of mosquitoes. It can give you a longer growing season from the ag side, but it also means you have a longer growing season for the pests, so they can have extra life cycles, and a longer growing season for the weeds as well. So it's kind of a mixed bag on how beneficial the warming winters are going to be for us at this point, although there are some obvious benefits from heating costs and things like that. So there are these kind of concerns with increasing temperatures. Probably the other one that I spend a lot of time on is the increase in precipitation. So here it's a little different pattern than the temperatures. Temperatures all out west, getting warmer in the north. On the precipitation side, most of the wetness is occurring across the central part of the United States and also in the northeast as well. So we're seeing in Illinois right now increases of about 10 to 15% on annual precipitation over the last century. And then that's pretty true of some of our neighboring states too, in Iowa and so forth. So this has given us quite a few problems, and even worse is that we're seeing more of the heavy rain events. So this is a graph of the 2-inch rain events by decade or half decade across Illinois. You see the early part of the record, it's not that many, and then the numbers increase over time, and so we're in this period of the last 30, 40 years of much more frequent occurrence of these wetter events. And this is true not only of the 2-inch, but 4-inch and 8-inch events. And not only single events, these are just one-day totals, but also you look at the monthly totals, they could read off a whole list of how many months we set as the wettest or second wettest in the last couple of years. So we're not only single storms, but multiple storms in a month that are giving us high monthly records as well. So this has led to quite a few problems in Illinois. One of them is we've seen is this problem with what we call urban flooding. So this is different than river flooding, where the river comes up and floods people out on the floodplain. This is outside of the floodplain, in the river, in the streets, and in the basements of homes and things like that. It's about a $2 billion loss in the last 10 years for Illinois. So yeah, everybody's basement gets flooded. And it's really this combination of increased heavy rainfall events, this impervious soil or surfaces that we put in place in our urban areas, and also the aging infrastructure as well. So it's kind of this combination. And we see a lot of problems like that where climate change isn't necessarily causing the problem by itself, but it's making a problem worse by, in this case, enhancing the heavy rainfall events. So it's a real problem for us in Illinois. So these are, this is not an abstract concept. They're things that are actually happening right now and causing us real money losses in Illinois. But also these kind of things are going to have big problems in terms of health considerations. If your basement's flooded, it's not just rainwater, it's sewer water, which is pretty nasty stuff. And then you get mold and mildew after the fact. And then you got the kind of the psychological effects of, I've just lost all my valuables in the basement kind of thing. So there's a lot of things going on in these urban areas with this heavy rainfall. On the ag side, we also see these kind of problems with too much rain, especially in the springtime, can cause planting delays, or you have to replant, or you get soil erosion, or you get the runoff of the nutrients. There's a whole list of things that can happen, especially the springtime condition. As Bill was saying there about the losses from being too wet are probably more of a headache in the last 5 or 10 years than from drought. We've had basically one big drought in the last 10 years, that was 2012, and a lot of the other years we've had problems with too much rain in the springtime. So those can be real headaches as far as what we're seeing right now in terms of climate change. So in terms of where the increased concerns are, there's kind of like 3 groups that I work with quite a bit, and ag producers hearing a lot about the mild winters and the wet springs, as I just discussed, summertime heat and humidity, and also you throw in a couple of droughts. So just because we're getting wetter doesn't mean that takes drought off the table. It just means sometimes it's just less frequent, but we can still get intense droughts. And for heat and humidity, that can be a problem for if you're a plant or for livestock. And so there can added stress from that. So those can lead to dollar losses as well. And also for farm workers. I kind of think everybody just drives a tractor, but we have a lot of agriculture production in Illinois that does still require manual labor, and you get heat stress on those folks, and that can cause problems too. So there's increasing concern. I don't have I wish I had like an index of number of calls I get or number of times I get asked to give talks, but I would say the drought of 2012 was kind of a turning point for the ag community in Illinois. Before then, they weren't that interested in climate change, but since then, they've really become interested in climate change, and so I've done a lot of work with those guys. The other group I work a lot with is stormwater management, both at the government level, but also private engineers that are dealing with these heavy rainfall events, and so we're working quite a bit with those folks as well. And lastly, and I actually missed yesterday's part of this meeting because I was in Springfield talking to Illinois public health officials about climate change there. And so they've got a long list of concerns in Illinois. Heat is probably the most obvious one of heat-related deaths. So there's the infamous heat wave in Chicago and back in 1995. But also they deal with all the disease that can be spread by increased heat over time, and the ticks and the mosquitoes, and also looking at things like mental stress from these kind of events, whether you're flooded out or hit by drought. And also we're starting to think about vulnerable communities. It turns out that, and probably no surprise, that in urban areas, we know for a long time that low-income groups have been hardest hit. But then you get into rural areas, and a lot of rural Illinois is starting to be hit hard by poverty right now. And so you have a lot of areas there that are hard hit by these events, and sometimes they're even worse off because they don't have the easier access to health care as the urban centers do. So if you're in the middle of some of these counties, you may be 50 miles from a hospital or even farther away from any kind of mental help on the way. So in terms of adaptation, I've worked on a couple of different projects. Probably the one I'll talk a little bit the most about is the USDA. We had what we call a U2U project, useful to usable, and the idea there is to develop some tools for farmers to use in learning to adapt to climate change. So we give them some tools that look at historical data and data right now, and then using projections to see how they will deal in the future. We're also in the process of updating the rainfall frequency atlas for Illinois, and so that'll help out the stormwater management, we hope. Then we're also working with the American Planning Association and the Chicago Metropolitan Area Planning Association on planning for climate change and some best practices for that. We've got some case studies up in the Chicago area right now. So we're doing some adaptation work in Illinois, and just make a few comments about some of these groups, just kind of go in a little bit more detail here, is that one thing, when we worked with the ag producers in this U2U project, it was, one sense it was a little easier because they're already used to making decisions based on at least short-term weather. They're not used to making decisions based on climate change. In fact, it's kind of interesting, a side story is you never want to use the word climate change around farmers. It kind of ruffles some feathers, let's put it that way. But we decided, well, we can talk about weather trends and things like that. In fact, I had a farmer tell me once that, he kind of was skeptical of this whole climate change, and it's a political thing, so forth. And he was telling me about his ideas on that. And then in the next sentence, he was talking about how the weather had changed on his farm in the 30 years of his operations there. So it's an interesting disconnect where they kind of think of climate change as a political thing, weather trends, that's real. That's what they're actually experiencing there. So we have adapted to in terms of the communication. And also, the other thing about farmers, and we kind of talked about this in the earlier session, is that they make their marketing decisions based on global conditions. So it's not unusual for a farmer to ask me about, what's going on in Brazil, or what's about that drought in China and so forth. So they're already thinking in terms of global issues anyway. But it's very challenging to talk about long-term climate change. Part of the problem is that they literally have to survive for the next growing season, so it's harder to think out 20, 50 years out in the future. But we've kind of worked on that intermediate step there of looking out for the next couple of years. So, for example, farmers are starting to adapt to the wetter springs by putting more tiling systems in there and then better managing the tiling systems that they have in place. Also, after 2012 drought, there's several folks that are interested in irrigation systems as well. So those are kind of some intermediate reactions to adapting to climate change. So, and I think in that project, and I didn't go into too much detail here, is that in that project we had social scientists involved, and we had two-way interaction with the stakeholders throughout the project. I see a lot of projects where you kind of start out and you're trying to solve a problem, and you get right up to the end, and then you show the product to the stakeholders, and maybe it wasn't quite what they were expecting. And some of these projects just the tools end up sitting on the shelf. But this way, we tried to get them involved at the very beginning and then provided support after the project so they can continue to use these tools. The other one, I want to say some wrapping up comments here on working with communities in general, whether it's the ag community or our cities or so forth. And is that one thing is there's just too many of them. There's just a handful of us. If we had everybody in this room go out and work with communities, that wouldn't be enough. There's thousands of communities in Illinois, and it's just too much. So it's hard to have that one-on-one conversation. So we have to kind of revert to using tools or best practices and things like that. Also, paradoxically, we probably have too much climate data and climate models. I think a lot of end users are overwhelmed by how much is out there. It's true that keeping up with all the not only historical climate data, but now we have multiple iterations of climate change model results for the next century. It can be very overwhelming to decision makers on how they use that information. So that's another area where we need to work on. And I think also, too, is that there's too little knowledge of the vulnerabilities and thresholds for the communities themselves. We've had lots of conversations with various communities and ag sectors and things like that, and it's really hard to nail down exactly, identify all of the vulnerabilities, because some of them you don't know about until you get them, until you actually experience them. And some of these thresholds can also be changing. One of the things I've seen especially with drought, is that the corn and soybean hybrids are getting better, so they're a little more resistant to drought than they say were 10 to 20 years ago. So the response can change over time as well. So these are some real issues moving forward, kind of from the practical side of how to get stakeholders to actually use climate change information. So with that, I'll stop and then turn it back over to you. Thank you.
Okay, our next speaker is Stephen Smith from Dow Agrosciences.
Good morning, and thank you for the opportunity to be here. I just want to tell you to begin with that I've just really enjoyed the last day and a half being a learner with the diversity of presentations and speakers. It's really challenged some of my thinking. It's really challenged the way that I'm approaching some of these topics of climate change. So over the next couple of minutes, I just want to quickly review with you two models, case studies where Dow Agrosciences has technologies to be able to help growers around the world deal with climatic change. And with these technologies, not only does it help to minimize environmental footprint, but it also helps them to increase productivity as well in a sustainable way. So we've been hearing quite a bit about climate change and yield and productivity, and we all recognize it's impacting with drought and floods, temperature extremes, reduced water availability, too much water, the wrong time with the water, pest pressure, unexpected, too much pest pressure. It's complex, it's intertwined together, and it's variation. It's variable, and we have to work through that. And so as an agronomist, and my background in agronomy, I've actually from a fourth generation family farm in southeast Pennsylvania. And recently I was having conversation with my grandfather, who's 95 years old, and in his words, we were reminiscing. That means I was listening, he was talking, and he was talking about the good old days of farming 50, 60 years ago. And as I listened carefully to him, what I was hearing was, you know what, Stephen? Back when I was a young man, the winters here in southeast Pennsylvania were so much more severe than they are the last 10 years. I'd say, that's interesting. And he'd say, Stephen, do you know what? The creek that runs through the family farm, when I was a young man, that creek was twice as wide and it flowed twice as fast. Yeah, that's good. I agree. And Stephen, this whole planting thing, when I used to plant corn, we could predict those spring rains. It was so much more predictable when the rains would come, when they wouldn't come. And now it's just so hard to predict what's happening. And I'd say, yeah, things are changing. And as we've talked over the last day, and we've talked about climate models, we've talked about the current, we talk about the future, we recognize that with change, that there's going to be significant impact to U.S. crop productivity without intervention. And so that's the key. As an agronomist, I'm optimistic because I start thinking about what are the tools that we have in our toolkit to be able to provide intervention to farmers around the world. And so from my perspective and the perspective of the company I work for, and I work for Dow Agrosciences and been an employee for 20 years, located in Indianapolis, Indiana, we think about sustainable technologies to produce more food, but how can we do that while generating fewer greenhouse gases? How can we do that so we're producing more food on less acres of land? How can we do that while protecting land and water and families and communities in a sustainable way? So I'm going to unpackage for you just two real simple technologies, but again, I want to share with you my background's agronomy. And anyone that's been in kind of an agronomy degree or agronomy program, in your very first agronomy course, one of the things you learn about is these levers of interaction, the levers that influence crop productivity, and those are G by E by M, genetics, by environment, by management. And there's certainly, when we think about tools to be able to overcome climate change, we can talk a lot about the G part, the genetics, and a lot of speakers already covered that. I'm not going to cover that today. And we spent a lot of our time talking about predicting environment. I'm not going to really cover that today. But I do want to talk about the M of that equation, and that's the management. And because I really believe when we move forward and we think about technology and technology advancements, I think sometimes we forget about those small incremental management changes that farmers have been making in the past, they're making currently, and will have to adjust to in the future. And how can we as organizations, companies, researchers help them with their management to help them overcome the challenges they face? So I'm going to start real simple with nitrogen cycle, right? So all of you who've taken a soil science class sometime in your career, let's just kind of do a quick review of nitrogen management, right? We recognize that farmers around the world need to apply nitrogen to their farms so that they can grow crops. And we also recognize that it's estimated almost 70% of all the nitrogen that's applied has the potential to be lost through various routes, be it denitrification, be it volatilization, be it leaching through the groundwater. A lot of that nitrogen has the potential to be lost. And the trick is, how do we make it available to those corn plants or soybean plants or wheat crop or sugar cane, whatever the crop might be? How do we make sure that that nitrogen is available to that crop? Well, we know that if we're putting a urea-type fertilizer on the soil surface, if we don't incorporate it right from the beginning, that we're going to have the potential for volatilization or loss in the gaseous form. But once the nitrogen makes it into the soil profile, primarily nitrogen is going to be in two forms as a fertilizer. It's going to be either in the ammonium form, the NH4+, or it's going to be in the nitrate form, NO3-. Now, why am I going into chemistry here? Well, just bear with me for a second. If we think about within the soil profile, the soil particles are negatively attracted. Okay, so negative attracts positive. So the NH4 is typically attracted in the soil profile, which means it's favorable to keep that nitrogen in the ammonium form. Okay? We also recognize that it's a nitrate form, because it's negative, 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 they repel each other. The negative nitrate wants to do one of two things. It either wants to leach, move away, or if we have too much ponding and we have conditions where there's no air, all of a sudden we've got denitrification, we've got loss of greenhouse gases. So we've got this crop that's looking for nitrogen. The crop doesn't care if it's in the ammonium form or the nitrate form. It just wants nitrogen when it wants it. But at the same time, we've got another process going on that makes it even more complex, and that's this process of nitrification. And so we know that that ammonium favorable form of nitrogen that's going to stay there because of the positive charge, as soon as it enters into the soil profile, there are bacteria in the soil that start converting it from ammonium to nitrite and immediately to nitrate. And we're back to the NO3 form. Okay, so you can see that we've got a cycle here that's pushing the nitrogen towards a form that wants to leave and escape the soil profile. So here's the technology. So there's a technology from Dow Agrosciences. It's called Optonite technology. It's a nitrogen stabilizer. Farmers in Illinois have been using it for years. It's called N-Serve or Instinct. And basically these products work by reducing the nitrification, reducing the NH4 being converted to NO2. And this product simply works to inhibit the bacteria in the soil for a short amount of time, slows the process down, and it keeps more of the nitrogen in the ammonium form. And so it's a great technology that helps to reduce leaching, helps to reduce denitrification of that nitrate fertilizer. So this product has been in the marketplace here in central U.S. for more than 40 years. It was first discovered by Dow Chemical back in the 1950s. It received EPA registration in the 1970s, and farmers have had access to this for a long time. And the data supports that this product does what I've just shared. It increases yield and it protects the environment. There's two meta-analyses out there, and I'll show you a little bit of data here in just a second, that strongly support the benefits of this product. And so it's basically, a win-win scenario. From a farmer perspective, we're optimizing, we're maximizing yield potential. From an environmental perspective, we're able to prevent some stuff from going into the atmosphere or leaching into our groundwater. So Optonite technology, when we think about it, it's really about a technology influencing, when we think about G by E by M, it's a management tool for farmers to be able to help them improve their efficiency of nitrogen fertilizer. It keeps nitrogen in the root zone available to plants longer, which the benefit is greater productivity, maximize yield. At the same time, it protects the environment, reducing greenhouse gas losses. In 2016, this Optonite technology received the prestigious Green Chemistry Challenge Award from the US EPA. And it's one of the very few times that any industry products in our ag industry have received this award. Even the EPA has recognized that the benefits of this product, both the ROI to farmers as well as the environmental benefits, is such that it deserves recognition as a tool that farmers should be looking at. I want to draw your attention quickly to the chart, the very bottom there with the arrows. And this is from a meta-analysis from Wolt. And Wolt looked at lots of data that's been done, third-party university data. And his summary is that on average, there's a 7% yield increase when you use Optonite technology, a 28% increase in soil nitrogen retention, a 16% decrease in nitrate leaching, and 51% decrease in greenhouse gas emissions. Those are tremendous claims. But here's the interesting thing of the story, and this is why I brought this as a case study. We don't sell a whole lot of Optonite technology when we think about market share around the world. And here's why. For years, this product's been in the marketplace for about 40 years. Most farmers, as we'd position this product with growers, we would position it basically as a crop productivity tool. And we would say to them, here, you know what? We can help you increase productivity with this nitrogen stabilizer. Now, if I'm a farmer in Illinois or Indiana or Iowa, if I tell that farmer I'm going to control weeds, I can go out there with a solution and I can kill the weeds and the farmer can walk the field and the weeds are gone. If I'm going to tell him I'm going to control insects, the farmer does the same thing, walks out and proof of concept, the insects are gone. If I try to convince a farmer about what's going on below the soil surface with all the chemistry I just shared with you, all of a sudden they get very skeptical and they say, well, I'm just not sure if the return of investment is there. I'm concerned if that's going to be a product that I want to use. But something has changed over the last few years. And what is that? That change is, as we work with growers and states start to understand climate change, sustainability, environmental impact of nitrogen, states and watersheds and counties are starting to see the value of not just the crop productivity, but also all of the environmental benefits as well. And I can tell you over the last 10 years, the interest from farmers, not only here in the U.S., but around the world, in nitrogen stabilizers like Optonite technology is increasing significantly because they can see that as a holistic solution that not only helps them with productivity, but also benefits the environment in a sustainable fashion. Second case study I just want to walk through very briefly, and this one is from South America. And this has to do with climate change and its impact on sustainable beef production around the world. So there's some cattle pictures from Brazil. And we recognize, and you guys are familiar with this, the expansion of pastures has driven deforestation. And collectively, that's resulted in lower carbon sequestration. And so countries and areas like Argentina and Brazil, they've put laws in place, laws here in 2012 trying to prohibit the amount of deforestation, laws that try to give some stipulation of how many cows should be on the pasture. But at the same time, it's been a real sustainability challenge. And so Dow Agrosciences in 2016, we've been partnering with some stakeholders in Brazil to try to develop some more sustainable beef production systems in several regions. And so what we did was we had a solution, and our solution is a herbicide called Dominion. And we used that herbicide as a tool to help increase livestock yield per hectare by doing what? By managing difficult to control weeds and promoting more nutritious grazing grasses. So what did that do? Well, by going in with a holistic solution with these farmers, with this pilot group, we were able to implement sustainable intensification farming practices on 6 model farms representing about 50,000 hectares. And what we're able to do is 90% of the previously deforested area is now being used in support of very highly productive levels of grass, resulting in improved milk and meat. But what were the results from a sustainability perspective? How did this benefit the environment? Well, so the data is just starting to come in. We've got data from 2016, and we're projecting out for the next 5 years. But we are already able to measure after that first year on just those 50,000 hectares that we're able to increase soil carbon, right? We're able to reduce deforestation. We're able to reduce methane emissions. And at the end of the day, as we look at both calculated and estimated returns, we're able to look at on that 50,000 acres a return of reduction of about 500,000 tons of CO2 gases. Which you can say, well, is that significant? Is that not significant? Well, on a fairly small area with a fairly small pilot project, by helping to give them some tools to manage some weeds, which in the past they said, you know what, we're not going to manage that weeds. Back to the G by E by M, what we're going to do instead is we're going to go and cut down some more forest, or we're just going to have less cows on that pasture. By helping to control those weeds, we've given them a tool to be able to intensify the farming on those acres in a sustainable way. And the reduction is what? Approximately 112,000 cars, be the equivalent of 112,000 cars not being driven for a year, or the reduction of 60 million gallons of gasoline. So we start thinking about what kind of impact can we have by helping farmers around the world with their management of their acres. So I just want to wrap up with my last slide. Right? The last question to us is in regard to partnership. And I think this will come to no surprise as I wrap up my thoughts here. We all agree that farmers need sustainable ag technologies more than ever. And we need to make sure that we're looking holistically at all of the solutions that we're providing to those farmers. And when we think about those technologies, we have to not only develop them, but we have to do it in such a way that there's acceptance of these technologies in order to meet the needs. And that acceptance comes from education of both consumers and farmers. I was really tickled yesterday. I was really excited about how many students, and I appreciate the students that are here today as well, but how this room was packed with students yesterday, learning about sustainability, learning about communication skills, learning about how to prepare themselves to talk about the science that's necessary to make decisions to make a difference. But this education is a real challenge for all of us, and I'm really just going to make a charge to all of us as a call to action. We've got to continue to find ways to educate both the consumer and the farmer. And so what role then does the university play? And so here's the challenge. When I think about how we can engage together, I see the university doing kind of what it's doing this week, and that's the conveyor of the different groups, the working groups together. How can you bring us in a room? How can you bring together students and consumers and industry and public and private so that we can have open discussions and dialogue, and that we can hear each other's opinions, and we can make sure that we're sharing not only fact and reality and lots of bar charts, but we can also share stories and show pictures so that we can help paint the picture of what it's going to take to make these changes. When I think about academia, I think about the role of training not only the future scientists who are going to be developing the next level of technology, but also when you look at your overall population of students, how are you engaging them in discussions about where does my food come from and what is the impact of the choices that I am making as a consumer? And then from an industry perspective, we can't lose sight that our goal ultimately is helping farmers be more productive through both innovation and practical, responsible use of advanced technologies. So when I think about G by E by M, let's not minimize how important the management component is going to be as we move forward. Thank you.
Okay, and our next speaker is Dion McBay from Monsanto.
Oh, thank you. And it's a tremendous pleasure to have the opportunity to visit with you today and share the podium with those that have gone before me. It's kind of a trick if you're a public speaker. Many of you have had this the last 2 days of following behind a panel where I'm trying to remember. I'm so busy listening to the interesting insights they're sharing. I'm trying to remember what were we going to say that's fundamentally different. I think what we'll see is the conversations that Jim and Dow and Agrible have led build very closely to what we at Monsanto believe. in the introduction. I'm Dion McBay, as I was just mentioned. I'm the Global Sustainable Development Lead for Monsanto, which means I lead a team of people that help define Monsanto's strategies and positions as it pertains to environmental stewardship, biodiversity, and social responsibility, and how we behave as a manufacturer in the community where we have responsibilities to help care for not only our employees, but those that surround us in our industry, the farmers and the producers, all the way through that value chain, and who we share the communities with where we build our products around the world. And so my team helps look at environment from the spirit of care for the land, the air, the water, not just in our manufacturing footprint, but how the use of our products and innovations from the agricultural industry at large help farmers be a part of the solution to the issues that face the environment today, as well as thinking about from a biodiversity perspective and the focus on the protection of species, landscapes, habitats, and the impacts that agriculture can have positively and overcome negatively on the ecosystem at large. And as I mentioned before, social responsibility and the caring for people. And so many of the presentations that we heard this morning, and I know this week on the agenda, help address the dire needs of the world that we are in today. And I must admit, 23 years now I've been with Monsanto. I'm 46 years old. That means half my life I've been focused professionally in the agricultural industry. Well, the half that came before that, I grew up as a third generation on the farm with my grandfather, my father, and my uncle, and me more or less being the teenage unpaid labor most of the time. But I can tell you, we became very, very close to what it is farmers believe in. And now, as a professional, an opportunity to employ this in my career, our view is how we advance modern agriculture. Ultimately, as we think about sustainability, that farm I grew up on was on the Alabama-Tennessee line, and we tend to say things down south just a little differently. We would define sustainability as keep on keeping on. Right? If you turn back the clock to the mid-'80s, the Brundtland Report more or less said the key definition of sustainability is caring for the needs of today in a way that does not impede the opportunity of future generations to care for the needs of tomorrow. Agriculture is at the foundation and fundamental solution or potential part of that solution, depending on the practices, the technologies, the innovation, the advances that we continue to make to adapt to the challenges that we face. And I do think at times as an industry, representing the industry both as a family member that grew up in it and now as a part of it as my professional pursuit and passion, I think we spend a tremendous amount of time focused on productivity. And if you were a farmer, that's where you'd focus too. That's your top line revenue generator. And so much of what we target corporately, we have goals in place to help double yields by the year 2030. We're a good portion of the way towards that goal against the original benchmark of 2010. But as an industry, I believe FAO says we have to see at least a 60% continued increase in productivity over the next 20 years to keep up with the growing global demands for food. And so this is a real challenge in front of us and the driver of the farm. And the other driver of any business beyond productivity is efficiency and focus on costs. And we as an industry have advanced significant technologies, to your point, Steve, with great focus on farm viability for many, many years now. And so what's different? We believe that we are at a pivotal turning point where we have to continue to look not only at productivity and efficiency, the driving of yield or the saving of money that drives farmer profitability, but we have to do a much better job with sharing with society what innovation, what science, what farm practices are playing today in helping better care for the air, the land, and the water, the role that they play in driving sustainability. And I believe that agriculture is probably at more of a focus now than it ever has been. We have such a conscious consumer society today on how was my phone, not just the caloric content or the ingredients that made up a food product, but how was it grown? Where was it grown? What impact did it have on natural resources? Was it efficiently produced? Was it responsibly produced and provided to me? And so we know that society and consumers' points of view are driving more and more the dialogue of sustainability, and a tremendous opportunity for ag to participate in that space. And then those conversations and dialogues are even further accelerated by the conversation we focused on here this week alone in the key issues that are facing society. one of those clearly being climate change. And I fully agree with Jim. What is in a name, right? Was that Shakespeare? Climate change, Al Gore, global warming, all the way through to farmer, as you shared, farmer perspective that I don't agree with any of that, but I see rainfall patterns happening differently. I see heat accumulating differently. I see really, really wet springs and really, really wet harvests with extended periods of dry in between. What do I need to do to adapt to those challenges? Climate change and the science that's behind climate change and the science that's behind climate change is a tremendous threat to agriculture. Anytime we're talking about the change in growing patterns, heat accumulation, moisture, and precipitation, this is a challenge in the raising of a crop all the way through to its yield. And as these planting zones potentially shift or insect ranges change, we, as leaders in the industry, have a tremendous challenge to stay in front of that curve with helping farmers adapt. And I think it's tremendously exciting what technology is allowing us today to do, but beyond just genetic modification or significant advances in breeding and products, we have a great opportunity to focus on practices and the know-how that have made farming great for over the years and that are already in place, but to continue to accelerate innovation, modern agriculture, both in the terms of technology and science, as well as in practice. Innovation in modern agriculture has already, over the last 20 to 30 years, driven so much change in pesticide use, in land preservation, carbon emissions, the enhanced nutrition of outputs, time in the field, trips across the field. Science as a tool is an enabler that's allowing farmers to be more sustainable now than ever. And I think it's exciting that many of these technologies continue to advance. As our friends of Agrible spoke about earlier today, the opportunity to look at data science is probably the next and largest emerging conversation in agriculture. When we think of adaptation opportunities, knowledge is power. And the opportunity for a farmer to better understand what's the right rate of nutrient, what is the right timing or right placement, the opportunity to make better optimizing decisions that increase the farmer's precision, oftentimes increase the farmer's efficiency, but in most all cases give the farmer the opportunity to implement practices through better information and better informed decision making that drives increased sustainability on the farm. And beyond that, practices that are available to the farmer, I absolutely support the conversation that Stephen just led about nutrient management. And in addition to nutrient management, carbon smart practices, many of which that have been available for farmer adoption for now 20, 30 years, the conversation of no-till and cover crops have become so much more robust in the last 3 to 5 years as more and more farmers take responsibility for nutrient management and nutrient loss strategies and looking for information sources, products and technologies that complement the practices that they're using on their farm in order to better care for the land, the air, and the water. And so finding ways to do more with less. What can we do? At Monsanto, we absolutely believe that climate change is real. We are an organization built fundamentally on science and 100% focused on agriculture. And this is a tremendous threat to our farmers. And if climate change is a threat to farmers, it's a threat to global security, global food security, and issues that we believe agriculture can step forward and play a role in being a part of the solution. And so December 1st of 2015, in correlation with the Paris Accord and COP21, Monsanto stepped forward and made a commitment that we will become carbon neutral in our manufacturing and operations by the year 2021. Which means we're going to first look inside of our own operational footprint and make all the improvements we possibly can, but then second, partner with farmers to advocate for practices and technologies that help offset and improve the carbon emissions related with agriculture. We think that gives us a chance as a manufacturer to take a step forward and say we believe in it and we're taking action. But beyond that, we think it gives us an opportunity to change the narrative about agriculture at large and have a conversation largely with society and consumers in how technology, science, and modern agriculture can be a significant path to a change in environmental stewardship and ultimately in driving of sustainability. To do that, and this is where I'll move maybe slightly different, the focus to close. To do this, we're Monsanto, you hear a speaker from Monsanto be presenting to you today. There's probably one or two opinions that may move into one or two minds, and I will admit we have been a leader in the industry in science and technology alongside many of our great competitors. We might have a reputation thing or two that have come along with that. One of those may be that we think we have the answers. Sustainability is a space that we clearly recognize we must collaborate. There's no pinnacle moment to where we will arrive at the top of at the peak of the mountain, place the flag and say, ha, we are now sustainable, and Monsanto calls this to occur. We believe sustainability is a continuous pursuit for improvement, and it's one that the more we can accumulate great minds who are focused and passionate in this space, the better and better those solutions can become. And so I wanted to highlight a few collaborations that are occurring of the moment that we're honored to be a part of and very active in today, one of which is referred to as the Midwest Row Crop Collaborative. If you're not aware of this collaborative, you can certainly look for more information online. It's ultimately the convening of 9 major corporations, including Walmart, Unilever, Kellogg's, General Mills, Cargill, Monsanto, Land O'Lakes, and 3 of the leading global environmental NGOs, WWF, TNC, and EDF, all working together collaboratively to specifically look at how can we put our energy, technology, know-how, and ultimately resources behind helping farmers and agriculture move in the direction of reducing nutrient loading that today is a tremendous threat in the Mississippi River Basin, increasing water conservation, improving soil health, and ultimately helping continue to meet the needs of a growing population. Today, this coalition's in its first year anniversary. We've already moved forward with tremendous letters of support around policy issues that help support funding and conservation practices in existing and future farm bills. We've stepped forward and convened with policymakers, lawmakers, farmers, community of the industry beyond these 9 collaboratives to help advocate for modern agriculture as an avenue to increase sustainability. While we're still very much in our infancy stages, if you will, our sights are big, and we're predominantly focusing the first steps of this collaboration to make a difference in the watersheds of Illinois, Iowa, and Nebraska. And so many of you here at the University of Illinois, we look forward to your partnership in the initiatives that this collaborative advances. In addition to that collaborative, and as a portion of some of the support of that collaborative, another initiative that you may be interested in knowing more about is the National Corn Grower Association's initiative on Soil Health Partnership. The Soil Health Partnership itself is over 110 locations of research that's being done today on farm by farmers adopting sustainable practices so that they can share their data and learnings and their personal experiences in the farm communities that surround them. Monsanto was one of the founding members of this initiative. Today we're surpassing close to just over $3 million that Monsanto has so far invested in resource the NCGA Soil Health Partnership. We believe that the conversation of sustainability is necessary to support inside of the ag community. And we see initiatives like what the Soil Health Partnership leads today in cooperation and guidance from EDF, TNC, General Mills, Monsanto, the Walton Foundation, as a new and unique approach at bringing information that can help support farmers in making changes on their farm that will in fact increase sustainability and care for the air, the land, and the water. And lastly, the last collaboration that I'll highlight is what we at Monsanto started just over almost a year and a half ago, called the Carbon Neutral Collaborative. Again, we do not have the answers, and the opportunity to share our thoughts and ideas with others who have tremendous insights in the challenges that face agriculture today from climate change and the opportunities for agriculture to serve as a part of the solution are tremendous. And so we've recruited the insight from other leaders in global greenhouse gas emissions, particularly those as they're related to agriculture. We've been able to pull very closely with academia, as is represented here on the slide. We convened today with K-State University and Chuck Rice, Colorado State, a number of entities and organizations. We're very proud to be in support of the University of Illinois in a number of pursuits, including most recent submission for analytics and climate change that we've advanced here through Dr. all of a sudden, Dr. Guan, who presented earlier this week. In addition to that, here in Illinois, we work closely with Council on Best Management Practices, the Illinois Nutrient Loss Strategy, Illinois NREC, Iowa NREC, a number of associations that ultimately convene their power, their resources, their thoughts, and their passion in helping drive better awareness and education to the farmer to help them support the adoption of technologies, approaches, and practices on their farm that we believe can help present agriculture as a significant part of the solution to driving environmental sustainability. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for those remarks. I think that was right on target with what we wanted for the panel to speak on. So let me open it up to questions, and please feel free to direct it to the speaker. Yeah, Chris. Give it a try.
Question for Dion. The pretty aggressive carbon neutrality pledge for the company, can you say a little bit about the accounting for that? Is some of the accounting going to come from offsets from people who are using your products? Is that correct?
Yes, and thank you for the question. We agree with you. We think it's a bold and aggressive step forward. We think it's the right thing to do as an example in the industry, as an example in the community, to take action against what we believe is a tremendous threat. And so we're proud to have made it, but yes, it's significant and bold. We will make a portion of our goal through in-house improvements in operations, as well as improvements in the operations in the fields where we produce seed production that becomes the corn, soybean, cottonseed products that we then sell to customers. However, beyond that, as a manufacturer on a global scale, we'll continue to have a carbon footprint. Beyond our specific reduction in operations, we're looking at more quantification of the specific sustainability benefits of the products that are in our portfolio and our pipeline. Microbial science is a tremendous breakthrough, as Stephen mentioned before, that has a specific change in mineralization, the carbon cycle, the amount lost to air, to water of nutrients as applied. And so we're working closely with our partner Novozymes and openly in the industry and with academics to help quantify those benefits. And then in addition to that, globally, we're collaborating with farmers and NGOs in projects to help slowing deforestation or the reestablishment of forest. We're working on pilot projects today to help farmers in the adoption of carbon smart practices on their farm, where today a very small percentage of the U.S. Farmland is actually implementing cover crops, a larger percent implementing conservation tillage. However, a trend that can still continue to grow, and certainly the increase in focus on nutrient management. So it's kind of a multi-pronged approach. We do not have all of the answers, but we have a very strong confidence level that we're going to make significant progress against this commitment.
I think this is probably mostly for Dion, but others could answer too. A bit of a tangent from what you're talking about, but do you see any prospects that gene editing will avoid at least some of the controversy attendant to GMOs, and that at least the products of gene editing that do not involve transgenes can avoid the what I regard as excessive scrutiny and regulatory process?
Mark, I appreciate the question, and I'm going to invite my colleague here to chime in as well. I will admit I may be one of the least technical people in the room. That hasn't slowed down my passion for agronomy or time in the field and closeness with scientists at Monsanto. I will tell you, we're very optimistic. You know, the advances in plant breeding innovations are outstanding. These advances could very possibly drive new and different perspectives on benefits that the seed and the plant itself deliver. If we can create shorter statured corn that uses nutrients much more efficiently, drives similar yield with a different biomass generation, we don't yet have the quantification behind it, but we're working on that. And we think that the advances in gene editing We know that the advances in biotechnology over the last 20 years become tremendous enablers for us to look at in-plant enhancements, adaptation, resilience building that can make a significant difference in climate change. I have to believe that gene editing only opens the next chapter in that conversation.
And if I could just add to the other part of your question as regards to consumer acceptance and regulatory process, certainly anticipate the regulatory process to be as robust as with any other genetically modified organism. But from a consumer perspective, I would tell you, I think as an industry, we've learned a lot in regards to underestimating perhaps in the past the role the consumer plays in understanding about our technology. And I think as an industry, when the first genetically modified organisms were introduced 20 years ago, we kind of stood behind the scenes and we said, we don't probably need to do a whole lot of education. Consumers aren't going to care about this technology. And I think there was a mistake there. And so I think the industry, the organizations, we recognize that we need to do a much better job of education, of listening, of coming together in engagement to be able to not only share the science, but as we've heard from this conference, make sure that we tell the story of features and benefits, but also understand from an ethics perspective, what are the other opinions, what are the other perspectives, so that we can address those right up front.
So this is more of an open-ended question that any of you can take, but so there's so much science around how climate change has affected farming, and you all touched on it with your agricultural backgrounds. Why is it that farmers, maybe like the way they vote, it doesn't translate over to climate change being so urgent, as though this is their entire livelihoods? You would think it would be the number one issue that they care about. If any of you could touch on that.
Well, I'll go first. Again, being from a family farm, if one perspective that we forget about is if I'm a farmer in central Indiana, over my career, I have probably 40 to 50 growing seasons that are under my control. And that's the extent of it. And so we heard about cycle times in one of our other discussions earlier this week, and we think about that long-term perspective. If I'm a farmer, I wake up in the fall and I think about harvest, and I think about purchasing my seed, and I'm going to get ready for next year's spring planting. And their window of being able to observe much beyond that sometimes is very challenging. Now, that being said, they're very interested from a sustainability perspective, right? They don't want to be able, they want to be able to pass their land on to the next generation. There's a very strong, this is our land, this is our business. We want to pass it from one generation to the next. So let's do things the right way. But I think that's where the tension is. I only have 30 or 40 times to do this, and how can I do that to maximize productivity, yet at the same time manage all of the sustainability concerns that they're challenged with?
I think I have to agree with that. Maybe to add on to that is that it's just one aspect that I think that a grower has to be concerned with. There's a lot of things over, say, the last 40 years as far as increased regulation. The big thing back when I was in school was erosion. There's water quality issues that growers have to worry about now. These are things that, and oftentimes I think with growers, it's more of a situation, if a problem presents itself, there's a solution for it. There's something that they can do and see a physical change in their field. If I plant a cover crop or go to a reduced tillage type of situation, I see clearer water that runs off my fields or less water that runs off my fields. There's less erosion. Climate change is, in their minds, I believe, is more of a nebulous thing. It's sort of, and I think over the years they may have gotten, mixed messages. I sort of, at least in my mind, I sort of equate it to eggs. Eggs are good for you now. 5 years ago, eggs were bad for you, and they see that, and I think they sort of realize it, but they do see it on their operations. I think they're some of the best people that are really connected to the environment and connected to the climate and have sort of this mental memory of how things have been and how they're progressing and changing. And oftentimes I think they're looking for guidance, and we have I think that's improving as well through organizations like the NRCS and the Ag Research Service have they've started addressing these type of issues a little bit more when it was more of a soil and water type of focus they had many years ago, and I think they're moving more into that arena as well. And I it's a slow process to bring them around to this new way of thinking.
Only one last addition from me is your question on urgency. Think of every farm operation as a business, and change introduces to any business risk. It typically introduces some form of costs, and it almost always introduces a bit of an unknown factor. And so farm information, oftentimes very traditional, oftentimes multi-generational, where the practices that you've relied on most have been passed on generation to generation. And while technology and innovation have made those more predictable, better data and information around them, those changes are more evolutionary than they are revolutionary. I believe farmers care for the land. I believe they absolutely care for the environment, the habitats that surround them. And I believe many of them today are already doing tremendous things on their farm. Personally and corporately, we're tremendous advocates of incentives that allow farmers to take voluntary steps forward. And I think if we were seeking out solutions that would help, things that reduce risk or help mitigate the costs involved with taking that step forward would likely help accelerate the curve. But I do believe we made tremendous progress in the last 2 decades. I think modern agricultural innovation, advances in science, coupled with the farmer's heart for caring for the environment, will continue to see progress in the right direction.
If I can add just like one thing onto that, and just to add your statement, oftentimes I think when this change also is coupled with a large capital cost to a grower, oftentimes to change the way that they've been doing things, whether it's a new piece of equipment or adopting a new technology, that comes out of their pocket, and oftentimes that might be some of the reluctance for them to make this type of switch.
If I could just ask the last question before we break for lunch. So, all three of our private sector representatives have sort of presented examples of different technologies: climate smart agriculture, data-based technologies, and new genetics. Do you see an increase in farmer interest in adopting these because of the changes that they're observing, or is there really is it still going to require a lot of financial incentives and education and so on before you're going to see major adoption?
I think we can all make a quick comment on that one. Absolutely. Like I said in my presentation, the conversation's changed, and it's changed very quickly. And it's changed for a lot of reasons, largely driven by consumers back through the value chain that begins at the farm. The demands on where was my food grown, how was it grown, impacts on the environment are big. Farmers in their supply chain have not always been sensitized to the need to answer that question, and it's changing really, really rapidly. You then exacerbate that a bit with Des Moines Waterworks type lawsuit, where a city municipality literally sued the farmers of 4 rural counties that surrounded Des Moines with the accusation that the city was having to spend more than prudent resources in order to remove nutrients from the local water supply. As it turns out, that lawsuit stood in favor of the farmers and the farmers' rights, but nonetheless, the conversation was significantly accelerated. Even on a global scale, it became a conversation point. So the narrative and conversation around agriculture is changing very quickly. Expectations of society and consumers on how society is meeting some of their needs and wants has changed. With that, I see farmers as diligent as they've ever been about soil health and caring for the land and caring for landscapes and habitats. Technologies and modern agricultural innovations are allowing them to do that even better. And what we've seen in the last decade is significant increase, both in high technological approaches with data science, biotechnology, as well as in practice. The trend of cover cropping in Illinois, Iowa, Indiana is a slope that's off the chart. Now, we still have a really, really long way to go. But I believe the answer to your question is they see the urgency, and we're seeing trends that are in favor of saying we're moving in the right direction with a long way still to go.
I think an example of that, I agree fully. What we see tends to be a little bit more in somewhat of more specialty type of crops. We work with General Mills. We also work with Pepsi Cola. And, we have one of the products that we have is a sustainability tool, which in conjunction with the field to market organization, sort of consortium, we have an automated metric for growers that are within our program to calculate and report their sustainability of their operations. And a lot of that is driven by economics. One of the crops that we do that really falls under this is white corn, which is grown for things like Tostitos with Frito-Lay and Pepsi Cola. We also work with General Mills in wheat. We do a lot of work with like the Southern Plains wheat growers, and there's an economic driver to that. If they can show to these, or basically they conglomerate themselves and provide a large amount of grain that can be proven to be grown sustainably, they actually make more money for that grain. General Mills pays them an extra few cents a bushel for sustainably grown crops. And so I think part of this though that drives this, the farmers want to do a good job, but if there's an economic benefit to it as well, that really starts to get them interested. And that's where we've seen some success with our tools and getting users onboarded into that.
All right, please join me in thanking our panel and